Hello Year 11 and welcome to week 13 of the History Revision programme. Don't forget that this week we're looking at Nazi Germany Part 2. You should have already completed the knowledge PowerPoint earlier this week, and that will really help you to answer the questions in today's lesson. So let's get started. Okay guys, so in this lesson we are going to be looking at the exam technique for the interpretations again. You've already looked at this when we did the Weimar section, so it is the same technique but obviously looking at different knowledge. I'm just going to quickly refresh your memory about the technique needed for these questions. I think there's been some real improvement recently in this, but we do need to make sure that we're really tight on this, as technique is so important for these questions. So interpretations are kind of part of questions 1, 2 and 3. Basically in the exam you'll be given 2 interpretations, that's 2 different points of view about a particular topic, and you'll be expected to use different skills to answer the 3 different questions. So in terms of the skills that you need to look at, question 1, it's important that you definitely have to talk about content in that question. So that's basically what the person is saying. You have to talk about why the content is different, why these 2 people have different views. We remember this by saying cats. Remember our phrase, cats produce kittens? Question 1 is all about cats, that's the content section. Question 2 is all about produce, so that's basically the provenance section. So in question 2, you only talk about provenance, that's basically who made these extracts. So you've got to think about who they are, what's their background, why would that mean they have a different opinion? You've also got to talk about when they are writing and what's their purpose to what they're saying. Are they, for example, talking publicly to somebody, or are they talking privately in a diary, for example? So think about the provenance of the question, and you've got to compare them and make sure you're saying why they are different based on who they are, when they're speaking, and why they've made this particular extract. Question 3 is all about knowledge. That's our kittens section. So it's really important for this section that you really hone in on that knowledge. You've got to make sure that it's about point knowledge for each different paragraph. And don't forget the knowledge question is larger, it's 8 marks. So you do need to make sure that it is 3 paragraphs as opposed to the others, which are smaller, they are just 4 marks. So that's just a bit of a recap about the technique overall. Just don't forget, guys, cats produce kittens, content, provenance, knowledge, and don't confuse the 3 of them. So as I've just mentioned, question 1 is all about content. So that's our cats part of our phrase. Now, in terms of the cats question, it always asks you, interpretation A, interpretation B, how are they different? Okay, so you've basically got to look at interpretation A, look at interpretation B, just reading what they say at this point, and you have to talk about how are they different. Now, usually one is positive and one is negative. One supports something, one doesn't support it. Generally, that's what it's going to be. And then you've got to express how that comes across. So, for example, in this structure that I've just demonstrated on the screen here, you can see the first thing you need to do is pick out the main points that interpretation A makes. So you might pick out, I would recommend 2 things. I'd talk about 2 different things that interpretation A states. Now let's say, for example, interpretation A is a positive one. So you would basically give 2 different reasons why interpretation A is positive about a certain thing. Let's say interpretation B that is negative. You would then have to pick out 2 things that are negative about interpretation B. And then what you've got to do is write a sentence summarising how these views are different. Now, ultimately, as I've mentioned, that should be quite straightforward because one is going to be positive and one is going to be negative. So essentially, guys, this is supposed to be a really straightforward question. And recently, lots of you have been smashing the technique for this. But I do think we need to keep practicing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at an example on the next few slides, which is going to talk us through the interpretations themselves. And we're going to basically look at some model answers for this question as well. So let's get started. Okay guys, so as I just mentioned on the last slide, the first question is all about cats, that's content. And remember that you have to make sure that you summarise how these 2 extracts are different. So you've got to, for example, say if one is positive, one is negative or whatever, and you've got to then give some points from both extracts as well to back up what you're saying. So let's have a look at these 2 extracts then together and pick out some key points. So first of all then, interpretation B, remember that we're only looking at the content for this. So at the time it was smashing. When we went on our marches, the police stopped the traffic and passers-by had to give the Nazi salute. We were poor and suddenly had fine uniforms. I'd never been on holiday. Now they were taking us to camp by lakes and mountains. I'm ashamed to say it now, but to us Hitler was the greatest human being in the world. At rallies, we couldn't hear what he was saying, but we all screamed anyway. When war came, I was so excited. I thought, now I can show the Führer what I'm made of. So that's interpretation B. I think we can probably all agree that that's quite positive about life for young people. Now, ultimately, this question is asking us about how this interpretation is different to the next one about life for young people in Nazi Germany. So that one is clearly very positive. It's talking about how life was good for this young man, and he felt that things were going really well. I'm going to pick out some more about that in a second, but let's have a look at interpretation C. That's this bit here. We could not believe it. I remember that the leaders had told Hans that his songs were not allowed. Why should he be forbidden to sing these songs just because they had been created by other races? Then came to the racial legislation, and our Jewish classmates had to leave school. We were living in a society then where hate and lies had become normal. No one was safe from arrest from the slightest unguarded remark, and some disappeared forever for no good reason. Unseen ears seemed to be listening to everything that was spoken in Germany. So as you can see, that one is clearly quite negative about life for young people in Nazi Germany. So already we have our statement, don't we? We know that the interpretations are different because interpretation B is positive about life for young people in Germany and interpretation C is negative. Let's pick out some key points then that we would like to make sure we understand about this. So for example, interpretation B. He talks about it being smashing, doesn't he? He talks about the fact that this is a really exciting time for him. He also talks about the fact that he was poor, but now he was going on holidays and having fine uniforms. Well, again, you've got to think about the fact that shows that his life has improved. He also talks about the fact that he thought that Hitler was the greatest human being in the world. Again, that's suggesting that he was quite happy with the policies at the time. Whereas interpretation C, we can see that this person clearly had a very negative experience. So, for example, they talk about no one being safe from arrest for the slightest unguarded remark. I think they're particularly talking about the Gestapo there. They also mention the unseen ears. That's quite important too. They also talk about racial legislation, Jewish classmates being removed, and they also talk about things like music not being allowed just because they've been created by other races. So this person is kind of talking about the fact that society is very controlled and people don't seem to have much freedom in that sense. So let's have a look at a model answer for this question. Okay guys, so here's our model answer for question 1. So the question is, how does interpretation C differ from B about life for young people in Nazi Germany? So let's read through this together. Interpretation B is a positive view. However, this differs from interpretation C, as this is a negative view towards life for young people in Nazi Germany. Interpretation B highlights that some young people found being part of the Hitler Youth an exciting time, describing it as smashing. Interpretation B also shows how the Nazis benefited young people's lives. We were poor and suddenly had fine uniforms. This made many young people's views be influenced by the Nazis, as they felt important in society and their lives improved. However, in interpretation C, their life changed for the worse. Unseen ears were listening. This shows people had no freedom of speech, and so they were living in fear as they were scared to speak openly. Forbidden to sing songs created by other races shows that people were not allowed to listen to jazz music, highlighting racism. So that's it for 4 marks. Remember, this is only a 5-minute job. So the most important thing is that you definitely make sure you've highlighted is definitely one is positive, one is negative. It's really important to point out at the beginning or at the end how these views are different. The other thing is to make sure you pick out 2 different points for each one. So as we can see, interpretation B, we've talked about the smashing comment, we've talked about people having better uniforms, so kind of lives improving. And then the second one, we've talked about the unseen ears, the lack of freedom of speech, and we've also talked about the forbidding of different songs from other races, and that's also highlighting the racism that existed as well. So that's basically your first question. I hope that helps you to see it in action. Okay, so now I'm going to talk through the technique for question 2. Now remember I mentioned at the beginning that question 2 is our produce, so cats produce kittens. This is the produce section, and basically this is all about provenance. This is where we now focus on who created the source. What is their background? Why might that influence their opinion? And we also have to think about why they made this particular source, and also when was it made as well. So a number of different things we have to consider when we're thinking about the question 2 question. Why do they differ? That means why is one positive and why is one negative? Why do they have different opinions about the same piece of content? So Remember that this has to be 2 paragraphs as opposed to 1. That means you do your first paragraph usually all about the who, because that's usually the chunkier one that you can discuss. So you can basically think about who they are and why their experience has affected their views. So for example, you've got to think about their political views or their experience that they had of this particular event. That will usually come through in the description given to you by the examiner, which I'll talk again through on the next slide as well. Paragraph 2 is then about when was the interpretation made. So again, when you're thinking, for example, was it made at the time when feelings were high? Was it made afterwards with hindsight? That can also make quite a difference in terms of what they're saying. The other thing that you can consider is why they made this particular interpretation or source as well. So for example, is the purpose of the information to be shared with the public? Is the purpose to be actually kept private? Because that can actually make a big difference in terms of what they're saying. Quite often, if somebody is saying something with the purpose to convince somebody of something, that will make a big difference in what they say. Whereas if somebody is sharing information with a diary or a personal letter, then quite often they might not share the same information, if that makes sense. So quite often you do need to consider why they are saying what they're saying based on the purpose of their source as well. So that is something to also consider. I personally think that often fits quite nicely in paragraph 1 when you're talking about who the person is as well. Now, obviously, once you have talked about this, you then need to consider how they are different. It is about comparison again. So question 1 is all about why are they different based on who they are. So you do have to talk about interpretation A and B in that paragraph. Paragraph 2 again is about comparison. So again, we're going to talk about A and B in paragraph 2 and think about when they were both made and why that makes a difference to the interpretation. Let's get started by looking at an example together. Okay guys, so as I've just mentioned, we're moving on to question 2 now, which is the produce question, which is provenance. We're now looking at why might these authors have different opinions. So basically, if we look at interpretation B, this is the more positive one. This one is from Henrik Mettelman. He's talking in a book from which is called Through Hell for Hitler, and it was published in 1970. He was also a member of the Hitler Youth. So there's some key things about him from the provenance. The second one, Ing Scholl, she's basically somebody who was writing in 1952. Again, she's writing a book called Students Against Tyranny. And it's important we do know that her brother and her sister were part of the White Rose group, and they were both executed by the Nazis in 1943. She is somebody that would have been more exposed to Nazi realities, I suppose, rather than being kind of convinced by all the propaganda. So first of all then, guys, let's pick out some key things that we do need to write about in this question. So remember that we've got to have 2 small paragraphs for this. I know it's still 4 marks, but it's important that we do talk about who they are and why they would have different opinions when they're speaking and why that makes them different. So if we start off with the first point about the fact that who they are, we do need to talk about the fact that they are people that have completely experienced different things in Nazi Germany. So for example, interpretation B is somebody whose life actually changed for the better. He was somebody that was quite poor, and then he started to go on his first holidays. He got new shirts, and I think that's quite important because it would have made things seem more exciting. If you're getting to have free trips and you're going on holiday for the first time and things like that, you are going to have a more positive perception. Whereas obviously Ing Scholl is very different. She's had to go through an extremely traumatic event of losing her brother and her sister to the Nazis. And remember that her brother and sister only handed out like anti-Nazi leaflets, and they were executed for this. So you can imagine of course, she is going to feel really negatively towards the Nazis. So they had completely different experiences. On top of that, when we think about when they're writing, that might be different in the way that they've produced their answer. They might also be thinking about their purpose here. So in terms of obviously the dates of when they were published, one is 1970 and the second one is 1952. Now, although you could say, well, actually, they're not that different really, the important thing we could say is that when interpretation B is writing in 1970, this is a time when people were trying to kind of distance themselves from the positive views of the Nazis. So I suppose the man's purpose in this is that he's trying to give a very honest view, but he's also trying to say, I do distance myself from it now. I'm ashamed to say it now, but I don't feel this way anymore, but I am admitting that at the time this is how I felt. So maybe his purpose is to try and express to people that he does distance himself from it, but he's also trying to educate people about how he felt at the time. You could also say that obviously in 1952 in Scholl's writing, she's got nothing to lose at this point, has she? Because she is someone that opposes the Nazis, but she can speak freely in 1952. You've got to think by this time the Nazis had collapsed, and now she had her freedom of speech to say what she wanted. So let's have a look at these points in action with a model answer. Okay, so let's have a look at question 2 then. So why might the authors of Interpretation B and C have different opinions about life for young people in Nazi Germany? So let's read through together. These two people have different points of view due to having very different experiences of Nazi Germany, which has affected their views. Interpretation B is positive because his life dramatically improved because he was poor. A young boy who joined the Hitler Youth, received new brown shirts and went on holiday for the first time. This must have seemed exciting at the time. In contrast, Inge Scholl's view was negative because she experienced a traumatic event during this time. The Nazis executed her siblings, Hans and Sophie, as they openly shared their negative views towards the Nazis. Therefore, Scholl's opinion of being a young person in Nazi Germany is obviously going to be very negative, as she suffered a terrible loss. The interpretations are also different due to the date they were produced in and the purpose of the author. Interpretation B was written in 1970, a time when people were trying to distance themselves from any positive views of the Nazis, and he states that he once believed that Hitler was the greatest human being. This is a very honest view, as Henrik would have faced judgment for this comment in 1970. He may be writing to justify his feelings at the time and make it clear that his view has changed by 1970. Interpretation B was produced in 1952. Inge Scholl had nothing to lose when she shared this view, as Nazi rule had collapsed in Germany and her freedom of speech had returned. This would also have been a time in which people would feel keen to hear the stories of those that had disapproved of the Nazis, or even openly criticised them as her siblings did. So that tells us a bit about the points to do with their background, how they're very different because of what they experienced in Nazi Germany, but also when they are writing and the purpose of what they are writing as well. So, for example, I've talked about how the first one might be more of a justification, whereas the second one is more of an honest representation. And also, as I mentioned as well, in 1952, people would have been happier to hear about people that did stand up to the Nazis, whereas, they wouldn't have been as happy to hear about the positive views towards the Nazis. People certainly distanced themselves from that at that point. Okay, so that basically gives you a key example of how to write a question 2. Let's now move on to question 3. Okay guys, we're now moving on to question 3. This is our kittens part of our saying, and this is about knowledge. This question is always a which is the most convincing. So they will give you the 2 interpretations and you've got to say which one you are most convinced by. But it's important obviously that you do set this out as 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 has to be about interpretation A. You have to give different points from the text and explain why these points fit with your own knowledge, and you've got to use some specific details. You do the same really for paragraph 2, but you do it for interpretation B. And then paragraph 3, you have to say which one is the most convincing overall, and you do have to make sure you justify why you think that. So this question should take you around about 10 minutes because it is an 8-mark question, but you do need to make sure that you format it in this way and make sure it's point and then evidence with your knowledge, point, evidence with your knowledge. Don't forget, knowledge is so important to do well on this question. As I just mentioned on the last slide, we're now going to have a look at question 3. Which interpretation do you find more convincing about life for young people in Nazi Germany? For this one, we don't need to talk about provenance, we just talk about the content and we use our own knowledge to support what it's saying. So in terms of paragraph 1, we talk about interpretation B, we use some examples from the text and we back it up. Paragraph 2, we talk about interpretation C, we pick out some points, we back it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out some points that I'm going to discuss, and then on the next slide I'm going to talk you through an example of a model answer with some evidence and knowledge as well. So then, first of all, let's pick out the key points we're going to talk about. So I would personally pick out the point about when he talks about going on camping trips to lakes and mountains. The reason I would pick out that is because we can give some evidence about what people did in the Hitler Youth. The other one I would pick out, because you only really need to pick out 2 really. You can go for 3 if you've got time, but I'm going to pick out 2 for today. So Hitler was the greatest human being in the world, and that's what people thought at the time. The reason I'm going to pick that one out is because I think we could definitely use our knowledge to support the propaganda, couldn't we? And we could talk about the education system and how young people were indoctrinated into believing that. So they're the 2 points that I'm going to discuss for that one. The next one, I'm going to be talking about the unseen ears, because I think it's quite important to talk about things like the Gestapo and speaking through a flower and things like that. We could talk about how people did live in fear and they didn't speak their true thoughts at the time. We could also pick out the point about people going missing for no good reason. That's also an important point about things like concentration camps, which we could talk about. And as a third one, I suppose we could also mention the point about not being able to listen freely to different songs, because we could talk about the banning of jazz music in particular. So they're the 3 points I'm going to pick out, and I want you to see on the next slide how I've put this into action and how I've tried to blend my knowledge into an answer. Okay, so here's the model answer then for which interpretation do you find more convincing about life for young people in Nazi Germany? So let's read through it together. Interpretation B is very convincing as it states that they were taking us to camp by the lakes and the mountains. I know that members of the Hitler Youth were taken on camping trips to learn military skills. They found this extremely exciting and it helped them to build a love for the party and Hitler. Interpretation B also suggests that young people thought that Hitler was the greatest human being in the world. This is convincing as I know that many German children were indoctrinated to believe Nazi ideologies, so they would believe that Hitler was a great man and they weren't exposed to Nazi opposition. Instead, they were exposed to propaganda in every part of their lives, at home, at school, and as part of their youth groups. In schools, for example, children were taught only by politically reliable teachers, who would use textbooks which were rewritten by the Nazis to indoctrinate young people about Nazi beliefs. For example, Lebensraum was taught in geography, and the stab in the back myth was taught in history. Interpretation C is convincing as the Gestapo arrested people who moaned. This is referred in the extract when it says unseen ears seemed to be listening to everything that was spoken in Germany. This led to people keeping quiet in public because the Gestapo did not wear a set uniform. This made it difficult to know who you could trust. People were encouraged to speak through a flower, which meant they could only say good things. Interpretation C also states that people disappeared forever for no good reason. This is convincing because from my own knowledge I know that people were sent to concentration camps for different reasons such as petty crime, graffiti or political opposition. Furthermore, this extract is convincing as it suggests people were forbidden to listen to certain songs. I know this to be true as jazz music was banned as it was linked to black people and people were arrested for listening to it. The police state controlled the lives of ordinary people and this is reflected in the interpretation. To conclude, I think that interpretation B is more convincing because 8 million children were part of the Hitler Youth movement, so it is more common for a child to have thought positively about the Nazis. Few people had as much exposure to political opposition groups as the author in Interpretation C. These interpretations reflect different but both convincing views from different standpoints. So I hope that makes sense in terms of how I've tried to use information that I know about, from my knowledge to support each of the different points that are made from the text. Now, it's also important we think about the conclusion at the end here. I've gone with Interpretation B, not because it's the reality, but because that is what people would have thought in Nazi Germany as a young person. Most young people were exposed to propaganda and they were generally more positive about Nazi Germany. There are very, very few young people that were exposed to the political opposition and the understanding of Nazi Germany that Inge Scholl would have had. Okay, so it's really important that although we understand that that is a very convincing view that Inge has, it's all true what she says, but actually if we're looking at which is the most convincing about life for young people, B is technically more convincing because it fits more with what we know about what young people experienced. Okay, so try to think about that when you're forming your own conclusions too. Okay guys, so now it's your turn. You need to have a go at writing 3 of your own questions, but you're going to be looking at different interpretations. You're going to be looking at 2 interpretations about German attitudes towards Jewish people. So I need you to read these interpretations carefully and have a go at answering questions 1, 2 and 3. Don't forget content, provenance, knowledge. You can go back through the video if you need to hear things again, or if you want to get some sentence starters out of the model answers and things like that, feel free to do so. And also don't forget that you can find a document attached on Teams which has the questions that you need to answer on with the interpretations there as well. So have a go at this guys and don't forget to send in your answers to your teacher.